Writing feature articles. A little bit about Fiona. She is currently the HOD at Forest Lake State High School. She is passionate with her colleagues about teaching English, and after John Marsden's presentation, she is going to be even further reimagining English and keeping it alive and fresh. She's also our current president of ETAC. Would you please make welcome Fiona Lane.
Thank you, Debbie. This is another narrative. My day started with a narrative, and I was remiss in not thanking Erin Geddes for schmoozing my narrative this morning. I wrote it and then she added much better bits in. And Erin is also a co-author of almost everything in this package. She works with me at Forest Lake. She's the not-brarian there. She runs our library. And has a not-brarian blog site still that she runs, which is all pretty fantastic as well. So I'd ask you to look at her work there. And she'll be being my barrel girl today. So I wanted to talk about people, when the Australian Open, you need something pretty special. And if you look at how it happens with this young woman, she's got the odd muscle, and I wanted us to think about our kids as needing those muscles and that they take years to develop. They're not an overnight phenomenon, and I think feature articles, if they pop up in Year 12, are impossible for students, in my opinion. I think you really need to build them up and grow them slowly to have any chance of the kids having the depth of knowledge required to write one. So muscles are also required for writing. We get the £10 weaklings in grade 7, and hopefully we slowly build them up as we go. Our goals today are on the screen in front of you for your fabulous eyes to read. And we'll start at the beginning, looking at the complexity of the feature. So the first question is, why are they important? And I want you to first up speak to the person next to you about why you think it's important that kids can write features. Please share. So I'll ask for some people to throw some ideas back to the middle. This is not an ideal classroom space for us, so I'm hoping we can overcome the geography and still share ideas throughout the session. So anyone want to throw us some ideas of why they like or why they think feature articles are important?
That students are given a voice. They actually learn how to give personality to what they write and justify an opinion with personality.
I very much agree with that, yes. And could you just stand up so your voice comes over the glass?
Following on from the person, their voice is valued and they get some value out of it too.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous. And over here?
You will likely to engage with feature article once their school also to read an essay.
Okay. So people were saying it gives them a voice, and it also makes that voice valued for them. They feel like someone's heard that voice and that message was important, and that in and of themselves they are more engaging than other genre we work with. So I came up with a few reasons why I thought they were important, and I wish I'd put them up one by one, but I didn't. Firstly,
Is it okay to take photos?
yeah, this is being filmed as well, and it will be on the website. So this is one of the workshops that will be filmed, so you can get it that way, but you'd have to wait a little while. So one of the things is senior English requires them. It requires a public text, and a lot of the public texts are really hard to make realistic, I think, and valuable. Like, to me, it's the one you have to work really hard to get it right. And we can't believe the number of people coming back to our school and saying, I'm so glad you made me write a feature article, because in economics and all these other subjects, they're being asked to either blog or write feature articles, and they're finding the skills that they've developed with us are really valuable to them. So again, the blogging applies in so many jobs, in so many places. So if you're going to run your company, often you're going to have to run some sort of blog environment. I think, to me, those things translate really well. The visual things are important. And you get the idea of how to pull someone into your text. And the other one, the last one that I think is so important, is that journalists are so few in number. They're being cut from every newsroom by the day almost. And so that means a lot of journalism is written within companies and government. And so many of our students are going to have to go out there and be the advocate for their company. If it's a huge company, they'll employ a journalist, hopefully. But if it's a smaller company, they'll often have to write it. So I ask you to sell those features, if you aren't already, to the students, because it's a skill that many of them will find themselves using, if not just for their newsletter, for their organisation they're part of. So I mentioned also that to read on, we need just shameless flesh. I thought I'd throw you some shameless flesh, that students need to be beguiled, and I love that photo. I'm also arguing that it's a 21st century skill. And that newspaper editors realised they couldn't compete with the speed of the new media, because it's a 24-hour cycle and they have to write things very quickly. And I'm not sure whether you heard the Media Watch element where they showed you the automatic stories that were generated out of the program. You pump in 600 sports stories on basketball, and then you pump in the scores and who scored and when they scored, the data from the game, and then the story just is spewed out. And for the life of me, I could not tell the difference. They did the same with Shakespeare's sonnets as well. So there's an awful lot that can be automatically generated, and there's an awful lot that is already being automatically generated, and therefore newspapers themselves are moving much more to the feature, because that gives the personal voice, and that's the bit that hopefully can't be copied exactly in the same way. So all sorts of topics, all sorts of areas. I want to also look at why they're challenging. I've come up with a few things. I want you to talk about why you find them difficult to teach, or for your kids to write, please. Have a talk about that for a moment. Why are they hard to write? So I'll call in some fabulous comments about some of the challenges we've faced. Who wants to throw us something? We probably even have another mic we could grab, but I don't know where it is now. Anyone want to throw us something they've found challenging? It's less formulaic, the openness makes it difficult for them. It requires the students to have a real engagement with the current affairs, yes. So they really have to know a great deal to be able to be knowledgeable.
That idea of being still a persuasive piece and yet be objective as a writer, showing a way to be persuasive.
Okay, and that line between objectivity and having your voice.
We're just talking about the indoctrination of the essays, looking at essay speeds, very quickly.
Yeah, and that's probably one I found really strong, trying to unteach essays for the whole unit until trying to get them there. So I also said there's a million types. The genre is completely malleable. Almost anything goes, and yet I'm arguing that's not the case. But it feels to the kids, I think, that you're saying that anything goes. And I'm arguing that I've seen in my own schools over the years, and in many tasks I've seen over the years at panel, so many tasks that feel to me like, I'm sorry, aren't you asking me for an essay? Everything you told me to do was an essay, but you said to make it a feature, and I think for kids that's really hard. And I think for teachers that's been really hard. I think also they're the top. They're the best thing you do. You don't put your first people on it, you put your most experienced people on it. You know, your Trent Dalton and your Matthew Condon, they're recognised as being at the top of, in Brisbane, Trent's not Brisbane anymore, but you know, they're seen as the top people because they have features regularly and they're highly admired. In where I come from, in Forest Lake, there's not a lot of print in their homes, and I'm sure you might find that in many of your schools too. And if it is, it's Women's Weekly. And in my early years, I'd get kids writing beautiful feature articles, some of them, and then I'd think, oh, I'll send this one off to panel, you know, happy to send this one off, it'll look great. And then they'd put it in the Women's Weekly, and I'd go, oh dear, you so don't get that this wouldn't be, this beautiful piece of writing you created wouldn't exist in the Women's Weekly. There's daylight between that publication and many others. So getting them to understand the sort of the breadth of magazines. And the fact that I think the feature in the printed form in the magazine is the one that's holding on the longest. I think it's being read for longer by more people, but it's clearly on its way out. I also wanted to talk about how lovely they are. How lovely they can be. The last point I put up is that there's a lot of focus. There's a million PowerPoints and lists on the internet. If you're teaching a feature, do this and this and this and this and this, and then you'll get a feature. And I found that my B kids could get into that, my A kids could use that, but I was finding my C kids didn't have an entry point. And from that list and that malleability and that many everything goes, they didn't work out what had to be in it, and what they created was really not a feature. And I used to struggle to work out how to make that clear. If it's so open, what's the bit that must be there? So I thought we'd look at a feature. You've got this one. This is one of the loveliest I've read for a long time. It was last May, I think. When was it? Yeah, May. Mark Mordew. It's on the last page of your handout. So it's just the beginning of it. It's just the very first paragraph. And he says, I've been thinking a lot lately of books that hurt me, about those times in my life when I've been shaken by what I've read, how painful and valuable those experiences have been, and also beautiful, which may well be a darker level of appreciation to descend into. How books that mess me up are still probably the most important reading experiences I can have. This heart of darkness to our literary lives is not much spoken of these days. After all, something negative isn't just emotionally repelling or aesthetically or morally questionable. It's bad for marketing. And I love so many things about this piece. It's the beginning of an analysis of, I think it's 6 or 7 books that have been very dark but very important to this author, Mark Mordew. And he talks about these personal experiences and reflects on them. To me, it's one of the very best relevance of connection with sort of articles you'll ever read. It's long, and I used small pieces for lower levels, but and I don't think even my Year-12s read all of it, but some of them were absolutely awed by how he put it together and how beautifully it was written. So as a model, it's still there to be picked up on the internet. You don't have to pay to get that one. So it's don't look up that title. They never put the same title on the internet. But if you get a phrase from within it, you can pick it up. So it's still there now. So I loved, the Now group, the Heart of Darkness to Our Literary Lives, the Group of 3. But I also loved the flippant comment after the slow entry, and then the flippant comment at the end. I thought that was beautifully done. And I wanted now to look at how I've been working in the last year or 2 or 3 years on trying to get my kids to pick up the skills. So I wanted you to read a piece. Now, there's a piece in the middle that you'll either find very offensive or you'll giggle over, and I don't mind which you did. I was thought of pulling it out, and then I thought, no, it's part of the story. So Anthony wrote a piece, and I just want you to read it quietly and look at what's he done well and what's he need to do differently to get this as a feature. This is the Deadly Anna, based on the book Deadly Anna. So even though you haven't probably finished, you probably have got yourself far enough along to get some ideas about what has he nailed, what does, about the task of looking at the relevance of his novel to society is going fine. Anyone want to throw something to us?
He's formed an opinion.
He's formed an opinion. He's got certainly a very clear opinion on racism.
He's been able to use a text which has images generally reason to reference and make a connection to the broader social construct which we're also hoping that they can do, which is very
So his choices of an issue, of a current things happening were appropriate. You know, they are appropriate to the situation. What's he not nailing as yet? Tone.
Yeah, it feels like it's at times.
Yeah, it feels very much like an essay to me.
Yeah, I agree. And he also puts the reader on the back foot.
If you could
straight
just
away.
stand up because the glass cuts you
Yeah,
off.
that's okay. He also puts the reader on the back foot instantly through challenging, as I was saying, the rhetorical question, and then not dealing with it, or basically kind of going, I'm going in a different direction, or whatever you said is irrelevant, I feel.
So if you look at it in terms of the paragraph structure, it's almost, you know, Forest Lake teaches Peel, you can see, and I've done my Peel paragraphs, it's set in a set of Peel paragraphs. And so he's sort of done stuff we've told him to do, but in something else we've obviously spent more time teaching essays than we have feature articles at that stage. And so he just hasn't really picked up what's going on in terms of creating a feature. And certainly the voice is strong, but it's and I mean the clangor in the middle. And the teacher would have read that draft and said, I don't think so, that's not appropriate, that doesn't work. But he's, you know, you tell them that there's an informal tone and you can be a little bit flippant at times, and so in his railing against racism, he throws this bit of homophobia into the middle of it and doesn't get that it's not connecting well with the audience he's writing to. So I think it also gets that idea of not really connecting with the audience and understanding how the audience would respond to that situation. And he is 15 and his audience probably loved it, his, you know, friends around him when he wrote it. I look at our challenges. Again, we don't, in our school, we didn't, right from the start of the school, we found newspapers at home were just weren't really happening, and if they were, the one we buy is the Sunday Mail. And quality feature articles are really difficult. And the senior article just popped up, and we'd done nothing before it, and it was really difficult for them because of that. And our first tasks lacked any realistic context, and it wasn't really a task. So what we went with, what we've developed and where we are at the moment, Year 7's not involved because we really haven't tracked that back to Year 7 as yet. Haven't thought about how or whether we should. We start in Year 8, and this is a C2C unit, but you know, we like it still as a unit. The teen representations looks at how you set up attitude in an article, and I think that's an important foundation point. Then when we do our study in Year 9, we use a couple of weeks at the end to transform what they've done with their 12 Angry Men into a feature article. Then in the novel study in Year 10, and that's an example of the one you've seen. Then in Mockingbird, we head off on a different style in role at the time of Mockingbird, and the sort of trial's happening and you're writing a feature as if you're there at the time. And then we finish with one that we've shamelessly borrowed with permission from St. Augustine's, and it's linking romantic poetry to your own life. So that's where we go. And I'm arguing that if you're setting a feature article, that if you can never find a feature article anything like it anywhere in a magazine, it's really not a great task. If it exists nowhere, then why are kids having to do it if nobody else is writing it? So it doesn't mean it has to be the same text or even the same genre of text they're linking to, but if you can never see it anywhere and you can never find a model, it sounds a bit hard to me for the kids to do it if nobody's writing it. And that when they're writing, they have to very strongly be in the shoes of a journalist. So I look at what the journalists do to prepare. They go around and talk to people, and they record that, and they write it all out and have that as the words elude me. They research everything around the topic so that they've got this depth of knowledge. They end up with a strong idea of what is happening out there, all the people who've written on it. They find, then at that point, they find their angle, and then they make sure their take is not going to die in a week, and that it's going to have something to say for a while, because that's the genre. And so that's a lot of work. Some features take a year. You know, I look at the one in The Australian where the woman went out and worked for a year in the worst jobs in Australia, or what she considered the worst jobs in Australia, and that became a feature article. And I remember thinking, just 3 pages, and you worked, she did write a book as well, but you worked for a year and then you wrote a feature article based on that work. It's a big genre, it's a big piece of writing, and it usually comes from large engagement with the topic. So our first go at writing it is a group task, and we don't assess this formally. We do it as a task at the end where they get involved and get as far as they can and do as much as they can. And they've done an oral assessment where they've interviewed a juror. So they've read 12 Angry Men, or they've played it in the classroom, etc. And then they're a journalist. Their task is to be a journalist and interview the juror about what their experience of the trial was, their attitudes to things in life, and how they feel now that they've been through this process. So that means every group that's put together has the script of 3 interviews sitting there. They have questions and answers already done. So they've done part of the work of the journalist. And then from that material, that proper raw data, they're able to construct their article. But they also have a deep knowledge of the issue because they've been studying it for 6 weeks. And they know all about the jury system, and they know all the details. Sometimes if we throw them into areas they have no teaching on and they've done no acculturation around, it's very hard for them to have that authoritative position. So then we move to year 10, and that's the task you saw there. We get them to connect and write something for Q Weekend, highlighting the themes. And again, we always try to make clear what sort of magazine they're writing for and who their audience might be, and ensure that they're meeting that audience's need. So my class studied James Maloney's A Bridge to Wiseman's Cove. So we discovered that the issues that a lot of them were focusing on were homelessness, child neglect, abuse and body image. And so it occurred to me that that we had resources in the school that were really useful for that. So they'd read the book and they knew what happened to the characters, but they needed more. So we decided to interview the guidance officer, because she deals with all those sorts of things. She deals with kids on the margins. Kids don't deal with homelessness. I remember when I first did homelessness, kids described someone having a yelling match with their parents and then they ran off to the park, and that was homelessness, and that was it. They just didn't get that some people didn't have stable lives and what homelessness really looked like for a real person. And at that point, we used to bring in the big issue and get them to look at the vendor profiles in the big issue, so that they did start to get that understanding of the issue that they can't see in front of their face, even though it is in their school. You know, I think every school has kids who are genuinely struggling with their homes. So they had to develop the questions, we collated them, and we interviewed the guidance officer, we recorded it, and then we played it back. And so for us, that process gave us a realistic set of information. So the deriving of the questions was just as important as listening to her answers. And it didn't matter if they had her words word for word in their article, but they had some solid material to work from. So then we go to Kill a Mockingbird, and the interviews can work just as well there. So in this task, which you won't be able to read, I don't think, they've read the novel and they looked at the themes, and then option 1, and everyone does option 1. Option 2, I should scrape it because it's impossible for the kids to manage. No, everyone does option 2, sorry, the other way around. They can't write for the Make Home Tribune. They tried, they can't do it. They want to be an outsider saying, isn't this awful? a few people tried to write as an insider at Macomb, showing Macomb attitudes, but they couldn't manage it. So everybody now does option 2, and they are liberal from the north, coming in from outside and saying, this isn't all that fabulous, is it? What's happened? You know, what is happening with this trial? And so they write a feature that would appear at the time, highlighting aspects of the trial and the themes coming through. So, and again, the interview process is important. So teachers are setting up structured interviews around in their classes, in role, so that kids can get what a character would say, and interviewing the characters they know from the novel and working out how they respond to what sort of questions, so that even if those responses aren't used, those attitudes are understood, and that student stands in the journalist's shoes a little more realistically. I wanted now to look at the modelling, and I know Erin is a wonderful modeller, writer of models. So you've got 2 of hers here, and so I wanted to know what models you use for your feature articles, but I might just move on. And we've given you 2 models here, and the first one's in year 10 and the second one's in year 12. Sorry? Yep, Erin can talk about her first model that she created.
Hello. I actually started tinkering around with writing models myself instead of just using past student work a couple of years before I came to Forest Lake, and Fiona really encouraged me to pursue it a bit more. With our Year 10 one, part of the reason I wanted to have a go at it was because that particular year I had our extension class, and our students had a lot of concern about how to write a feature in the word limit given to them. They were the kind of students who wanted to go way over. And so I said, well, if I can do it, you can do it. So we sort of, the idea of doing it one is to be able to say to them, no, you're going to do it. And so I did it on the novel once, because they had all studied it previously. So I thought, I'm not needing to introduce any new content or ideas to them. They've read this novel, and then we can go through it and have a look at the ideas at it without all that pre-teaching and big ideas behind it. So when we had a look at it, as you can see, I annotated it down the side and we pulled it apart. And so you can see there's labels where it's things like, there might be facts or explanation or opinion or terrible jokes or colloquialisms or parts that are more casual. I introduced to them the idea that you could have, sometimes a sentence fragment was appropriate here, or that you could have, one-word sentences or ideas. On your example, it says, for example, what, huh? And I had to explain to them that that was okay. And that was really interesting for an extension class, because these are the kids who are maybe a little bit like John was talking about before during the keynote. These are the ones that were like, tell me exactly what to do and I will do it perfectly. And so for a feature article and saying, hey, there's a few different ways to do this, this was actually very challenging for them, just as much as it was for our, lesser gifted students as well. So that was the purpose of doing it in grade 10, and I had a lot of fun doing it myself. It really challenged me and made me go, oh, okay, well, I've got to go and do a bit of research. And I went, okay, I want a real world connection. I want them to make sure that they go and do their Google search, so I'll go and do my Google search, and found out that there was some horrible senator or something in the United States who was making all these anti-Jewish statements and things like that. So I thought I would draw upon them and then talk about the importance of the books to highlight that. And even though it's years and years after World War II, we still need these kind of reminders about why we need to treat people well, and why our words are powerful. So that was the Year 10 one. I don't know if the Year 12 model is in there. To come back to it? But that was the reasoning behind the Year 10 one. And then it got more complicated for Year 12, and I'll come back to that.
And so I showed you the process, and I think I included that sheet that has the process after the Year 10 one as well, so that you could see, that kids could see her naked thinking, if you like. This is what I had to do in my head before I could start writing. I had to know these things and go to these places to have a chance to get into this. It doesn't just exude from the ether or from somewhere in my deep and dark soul. I have to work before I can get there. I also this year for the first time, tried a really structured approach in my year 10, and I feel really happy with having taken that approach, and I think I'll do it again, depending on the class I have. My class has substantially C's, and the B's are not very high B's, and a lot of them were really struggling with all the writing tasks I've been giving them all year. So I knew I had a real challenge asking them to do such a creative free flow task, and so I decided to make it massively structured and then say, you can move off and do your own thing. I'm happy for you to deviate, but this is my starting point, and we're all going to learn how to do it this way. And then once we'd done it that way, some of them were able to go off and do it in quite different ways. I liked this structure, the idea of the billboard. And I don't know whether everyone's always had the billboard, but I'd never seen the term before this year. And I love the billboard because for me it's like the hypothesis, and that's what goes wrong, I think, in a lot of student feature articles, is they don't have a hypothesis, and if they do, they don't make it very clear, and it doesn't control the piece. Now, if you say a hypothesis, it means you get into that territory of, oh my God, they're going to write an essay and they can't write an essay. But just as an essay needs to be controlled by an approach, a take, an attitude to the topic, a decision about where it's going, I'm arguing that the features need that very clearly done at a certain point after the lead and not too far after the lead. And it's like a billboard. Here's my billboard in very few words where I'm saying, this is what I think. So for me, that approach I found powerful for my kids to say, you need to have that really clear understanding and make it clear at this point and make sure everything else is consistent with that line you've set up. I also decided to teach it completely out of order. I'd just done my novel and they'd just done an oral assessment around their novel, so they knew it. So I decided to start here with the novel's theme, and I decided to get them writing what we call EEs, because we use the Peel structure. And so we started saying, here's where this character does this, and here's what I know about it, and here's and explaining what it shows about their topic, racism or whatever. And so that's a piece that comes well into the article, but I knew that was the first thing that they could do well and that they would feel comfort around. So we did that, and they were horrified by not starting at the beginning, and they argued with me most lessons, and I said, no, we will get to the beginning. It's really hard. We're going to start with this bit, and then this bit, and then we're going to come back to the beginning, and you will get it, but we have to do the bits we know well first. And then from there, we did our quotes from the expert, because we'd done our interviews with the guidance officer. So we got our interview material and translated that into feature style in the classroom in pieces. So we'd done those two sections. That left them then to go and do some more facts and figures and to do their research and add that in. So whilst that's not exactly how you want it always to go, for my class it gave them an entry point. And then we went to the lead, and I decided to be even more mean, and I decided to encourage them all to do narrative leads, and showed them other leads and said there are a whole lot of options. I'm going to show you a whole lot of options, but rather than giving them 8 options, here's your sheet with 8 options, I thought it was more powerful for a weaker class to teach the narrative lead well and find a whole lot of times where it had happened well. And that, I think, was a successful choice. The other thing that we've done since day dot is make sure they don't see articles only away from the magazine. So we buy sets of newspapers when they're cheap, and now they include Saturdays, and even if they didn't have them, I would still buy, spend a couple $100 getting sets of newspapers. So I've got this weekend 30 copies or 15 copies, and I've got a whole lot of them, so you can walk in and go, let's browse. What does it look like? Where does it live? Where does it sit? What's its natural home? And therefore, okay, so yes, there are 2 or 3 features, and they sit amongst all this other stuff, and they want to spend all their time reading the other stuff. So I give them a little time to read all the little bits and pieces, the regular columns and regular bits and short things that they like and enjoy reading, and say, now we've done that, now we know where it lives, and we've got our contents page nailed down, and we know the difference between the features and all of that. Now we're going to go in and find our feature that's going to be our prime material inside this magazine. So I think it's really important that you have class sets so you can achieve that, and I don't think it's a very expensive thing to do. So they bathe in it, and then from that article we did really focused analysis of how they did particular things, how they got into the article, how they got out of the article, their tone, their vocabulary, their paragraph length, their style, and all the informal things. And that comes, I'll talk about the informality more in our next article. So I'm going for a release of responsibility. I did it very unstructured, very structured in year 9 and 10, and hopefully they can fly solo by year 12 then with a lot less assistance. And what we started to do was also talk about features for years, and saying we are feature writers in English, and feature writers read them, and so you have to read them, and you should be reading them and buying these magazines. And just because your parents don't buy the Australian, well, I can have reasons for not wanting to buy the Australian, but I like the magazine, I really do. I think it's worth having in my house, even if some of my friends criticise me just because I love that magazine. But it's worth you going and spending money you would have spent on a coffee on that magazine instead. So it's not up to us to provide everything. I want them to become consumers of magazines of quality for 3 or 4 years heading into year 12, because this is a genre that's difficult. This is something you will take and have to do in the future as well. So you may as well nail it now, and you nail it by reading it. Okay, you have to. So I think we have actually achieved that with our kids. They are not. There's a range of kids, but I think we've changed their cultural background over the last 4 or 5 years in that regard, and they are buying them themselves. Their parents don't buy them for them. So in 12, we, as I said, borrowed this from St. Augustine's, but it's not a crazy idea. So they're a journalist and they're writing a feature in a magazine, and they have to look at the Romantic poets and how they're prophetic for today, how they still resonate for today. So we give them a list of magazines that we think will stop them writing for the Women's Weekly. That was the first year that the Women's Weekly happened, and every year since then we have a big billboard that says, don't do that ever again. So, and we've got in the library the Peppermint and, what's the other lovely one? Frankie and Peppermint, which are just beautiful magazines. They're just a joy to hold and a joy to turn the pages of. And I have never been able to afford to buy a set of those, and maybe I should, but that would cost a lot. But we bring those magazines into the classroom so that they understand that they are treasured artistic pieces now, and artefacts in themselves, and that's what you're writing for, something that's going to be part of that beautiful artefact. So we suggest they do Great Walks and Surfing Life. No one ever has. They want to go for culturally sort of more middle class things. Maybe we're moulding them in horrible ways. I go then to Erin's model, and she can talk to you about that.
Okay, hello again. Yeah, this one is in there as well. So The year after I did a Year 10 model, I decided to have a go at a Year 12 model for this task. And it was kind of an interesting experience because obviously it's more challenging to write. But one of the things that we noticed is that we had students borrow very heavily from this article the first year we did it. And we found that we even had to go and then very explicitly teach the students that you can't just take that joke and change it, because we'll know, because someone out of the teachers wrote it. And that was kind of interesting and frustrating. I was fortunate in that sense. I had Year 11s, not the Year 12s, so I didn't have to constantly see my own writing thrown back at me, which was probably a good thing. And this year, our Year 10s, when I wrote that, are now our Year 12s, and they got that a lot more as well. They understood that they had to, they couldn't just imitate the exemplar's voice, they had to find their own, and that was really important. And something that I hope you, Fiona will talk about more later, we have a student's example in there as well. So we ended up doing the romantics, and I said it was connection to modern life, and I did Ozymandias because I really like that poem, and talked to the kids about how I just really like this poem, and this is why I liked it, and we did the usual poetry kind of analysis of it, and this is why it's beautiful, and this is why it's a conundrum, and this is why I think it speaks to us. And this article is, as I said, a couple of years later, highly flawed, and you'll see that there's weird errors in it and there's things that I would do differently now. But I like talking about the flaws now, and part of me, the English teacher, wants to go back and fix them all up. And then the other part of me is like, no, you've just got to let them sit so that you can actually use them as teaching points with the students as well, and talk about my own reflection on it and say, well, yeah, if I did this again, I would probably do this a little differently, or I might look at this a bit more, and that kind of stuff. And as I said, it was a really good starting point for them. And the thing about this article is the complexity definitely goes up. There's a really big jump, even between Mockingbird in Year 11 and doing the romantics as well. But the thing that really works with this is the students really have to find their own voice, because it's their poem. We don't give them a poem. We do actually say, go out and find a romantic poet and find one of their pieces and talk about the modern connections. And we give them more guidance than that, but as I said, it's quite a broad task in that way. And we have a few students that spend, a little bit of while like faffing about trying to figure out what poem they're going to do. But as I said, it's been a really, really interesting one, especially now that our current 12s are were the 10s that 3 years ago we really started trying this process on, and it's been really rewarding this year watching these students with these 3 years of this approach to it really start to get some beautiful pieces. Not that we didn't last year, we had some lovely ones as well, as Fiona will talk about, but watching these kids get all 3 years of the benefit was really, really good.
So what I like in Erin's model is that really, really personal voice that comes through. They're very much how it gets inside her soul and her life. And our kids really did mimic that voice when they found it. I like the flippant tone, and the kids tried to imitate that and have played around with that. But then there are other kids who have decided not to use that flippant tone because it doesn't suit them. And so that was a really important learning, that you don't have to be writing like Erin to do well. You find your voice yourself. I think they had a depth of understanding of the poem. When they first started this task, they wanted to do the essay in the middle of it, to show me that they knew it was a metaphor. And it's like, I really don't want to know that. And so we don't draft this one, this is an exam. So they're writing it for themselves. They've got a week's notice. And so it's an exam piece. We write it on a great big piece of paper. We offer the lines and the spaces to put their pictures. They can bring their titles and their pictures. It's not about how it's laid out. It's more about understanding that it sits like a feature article. So it's an exam piece, and it's really, they have to write it on their own at home after our support. And they've done that in Year 11 with Mockingbird as well. It's the way we do Mockingbird. So the depth of understanding of the poem is there, but it's because you understand the poem that you're reflecting, as opposed to spew out everything you know about the poem. and you get a deeper level of reflection on personal experience, that personal reflective writing being really useful for the kids, I think, in QCS, because they bring their whole lives into the QCS. So being able to do that nicely, I think, is an advantage for them, and in their personal blog life that many of them will lead. So again, that voice is so important. And again, we've got that through modelling through existing features. And you'll see that the last one is really more of a column. Are you going to allow them to use a column style? You know, what's the difference? I looked it up on Google. Apparently the columnist, you know, the difference is they don't cite the sources, but everyone argues over the level of personal, opinionative nature, but because that's such a contentious area of whether something is opinionative or not, I think it's more the citing that's the difference. In the journalists, you cite who you interviewed and how you came to that understanding, but in the column, you just respond as a person. And I think there's they both have that complexity and that personal insight and that informality in doing so. The other one that I read last year that I thought was really lovely, and I have given you a copy, and I don't know whether that's available on the net, so this is probably illegal for me to put it up there, but it is a beautiful one. I'll read a little, again, the beginning of it. This is Nikki Gamel. So to a vivid weekend, where the relentless assault of emails and tweets and newspapers and magazines online have been shunned for a diving into something deeper, stiller. A book from English, I think it's supposed to be England, just published. Poems that make grown men cry, 100 men on the words that move them. And then just a little later she says, being immersed in this emotional wallop of a book feels like the opposite of that world of emails at day's start and stutter that have to be answered immediately. The opposite of writing a column during a child's soccer match with the laptop resting on the car's steering wheel. The opposite of waking at 3 a.m. with ideas buzzing and checking the news while you're at it because you can, you must. The opposite of grazing endlessly, distractedly on all those varied grasses of the internet, flitting from one vast plain to another, but never grabbing the most succulent of stems, those closest to the earth, never grabbing anything too much, too deep or too rich. Other parts of that article are written much more plainly as well, and it's the variety of sentence structure and the variety of her seriousness throughout the article that I think makes it so lovely. They're not all going to be Vicky Gamels. You know, she's a very experienced writer, but I think they need to be exposed to those ones, and as they come up, you need to grab them and use them and exploit them. And again, it doesn't have to be, if you're doing it connecting to a novel and this is poetry, it's still the same sort of task. And these things do come up in the Australian magazine, the review in the Australian magazine, as well as Canvas in the Career Mail, as well as their magazines. So these articles do come up infrequently, but they do. So grab them when you can and use them well, I would suggest. I think feature articles have tried in the past to go, okay, let's make sure they can name all the poetic techniques or the techniques used in the book. And I think it's not a genre that can do that. It can't tell whether a bright student has read the book. It can tell you whether a weak one has. But a bright student can write it without reading the book. But they're probably not going to anyway. And so I think you've got to let that go when you're doing this, because when you're doing it, you are creating, not evaluating meaning. Okay, there's evaluating the meaning in the text and society and applying it to yourself, but it's so much about creating when you're doing that text, and to focus on the fact that you've given them that journey through the novel, and based on that journey, they can then create something that's real and valuable to them. So, the last one is a feature by one of my students. And when we first read it, we just loved it. And then when we typed it out, we didn't like it as much. And I could criticise a million things in it, but I still think she's got a voice. And she's on the back cover. So have a little read for a minute. Again, it's an exam thing. Does anyone want to share things that that are working for this young woman? The tone. Very personal, and I think that's probably something we achieved, that a lot of them went very personally and some of them went very politically, but because that felt more comfortable for them, but a lot of them chose personal as an easier way to get something that was real and spoke strongly. I would argue I wanted to have her billboard a little earlier. In each of the ones I read, I wished it had come just a little earlier. I felt it was too long before I knew what they were on about. So that was on reflection. That's something I'll teach differently next time I do it, and I'll try and get them to get that in just a tiny bit earlier. That's my gut feeling, having a rereading it now as a typed piece.
Don't you find that when you're reading real books, lovely adventure articles in the media, don't you find that happens?
Sometimes it does take a long time.
A long time to get that build up.
Yeah. And having spent a lot of time looking at them recently, I think some come in very quickly and some come in after a long graze. I think more of them come in quickly. The ones I've been reading that have been relating to what I've been doing, but again, it's a judgment call, and it's a play. It is a personal style, yeah. So that's where we are now. So I forgot to put my email address, and it's FLAIN1, and I'm happy to, and I meant to do this earlier, I'm happy to email the PowerPoint if you would like. I was going to put a piece of paper here so you could write your email address,